Women have been integral to the A.R.E, to its very existence. When the Cayce Hospital went under in 1931, it was Edgar Cayce's stenographer Gladys Davis who sent out hundreds of letters to those who had supported the work in the past. She pulled together a community that brought Edgar back from despair by reinvigorating the work. The increasing demand for Edgar's readings, coinciding with the height of the Second World War, meant that he, Gertrude, and Gladys needed much more help to keep the A.R.E going. The office force grew to include several more women who took over various responsibilities. Gladys trained Jean Fitch and Grace Primo to also take down the readings. Mary Wersing served as bookkeeper, Catherine Patterson addressed envelopes, Gussie Milloway ran the mimeograph machine to publish the bulletins, and May St. Clair helped Gladys with appointments and reading transcriptions. Esther Winn, a member of Norfolk Study Group No. 1, who led the effort to publish A Search for God, also edited the weekly letter and the bulletin. She also became the first coordinator of new study groups. This team supported Gladys in the months after Edgar and Gertrude Cayce's deaths in early 1945. Though some would move on to other places at war's end, their dedication provided the energy needed to reimagine the A.R.E a second time. Its new mission, to share the information in the Edgar Cayce readings with the world. In the early 1950s, Lydia Schrader Gray became the first speaker to travel the lecture circuit with Eula and Cayce. They would pack their cars with A.R.E books and pamphlets, crisscrossing the U.S. to connect with people who had found the Cayce readings. These first generations of women who had worked with Edgar Cayce, or became interested in the readings in the decades after 1945, created an ecosystem of knowledge. Through study group participation, staff work, writing, public speaking, and all manner of other contributions. Here are just a few of the many women who made their careers exploring and teaching the wisdom found in the Cayce material. Esther Winn, a retired school teacher living in Norfolk, Virginia, and a member of Norfolk Study Group No. 1, led the effort to compile the material that would become A Search for God. She contracted with William Byrd Press in Richmond to publish Book 1 in 1942, and later worked with Eula and Cayce to get Book 2 printed in 1950. In a note discussing the book's contents, Esther wrote, "What is to be stressed in the preface of the book? That the intent is not to furnish informative data, but rather to give that which if lived, or as it is lived, in the experience of the individual, will answer to that within self, for the assurance of not only soul awakening, soul developments, but the continuity of life." Ruth Lenore met Edgar Cayce in 1931, and over the years received 12 readings from him. She often visited the Cayce home, and was one of the original members of Norfolk No. 1. She was also one of the original members of the Glad Helpers Prayer Group, and served as prayer group secretary starting in 1950. In Ruth's words, "The first time I ever heard of Edgar Cayce was through one of my sisters, who worked in an engraving and printing office in downtown Norfolk. One day while we were having lunch together, she said to me, 'We're making a booklet for a man who has just moved to Virginia Beach, and he does something very strange. If you are sick, he can go into a sleep or trance state and can tell you what the trouble is and what to do about it.' I felt such a strong urge to meet this man that I said to my sister, 'Can you get me one of those booklets?' She told me that she could, but she never did. Time passed and I forgot about it. Then another sister, who had built a home next door to mine, became pregnant. The doctor made a mistake about the time and gave her something to stop the pains, and she died within a week. The family had been called to the hospital at midnight, and when the nurse entered the room at 5 o'clock that morning to tell us that my sister had just passed on, an inner voice said to me, 'If you had known that man at Virginia Beach, your sister would not have died.' The message was repeated over again. By the following spring, her house had been sold and the people had moved in, but I had not met them. One morning, someone appeared at my front door and said to me, 'I'm your neighbor, and I have a daughter in the Cayce Hospital at Virginia Beach. She's due for a check reading, and I thought maybe you'd like to ride down there with me.' I felt that God was giving me a second chance to meet Edgar Cayce, so I accepted this wonderful opportunity at once. A desire of my heart was coming to pass, for I was most eager to listen in on a reading by Edgar Cayce. This was to be my only visit to the Cayce Hospital before it closed. After Edgar Cayce showed us around the hospital, we followed him to his home, where all the readings were given. Then Mr. Cayce proceeded to get ready to give the reading. His first step was to loosen his clothes, shoelaces, necktie, shirt cuffs, and belt, in order to have a perfectly free-flowing circulation. Then he lay down on the couch in his office. Once lying comfortably, he put both his hands up to his forehead to the spot where observers had told him the third eye is located. Next he began to pray. Then he waited for a few minutes until he received the go sign, a flash of brilliant white light. This light was to him the signal he had made contact. After seeing the light, he moved both hands down to his solar plexus, and his breathing became very deep. His eyes began to flutter and then closed. Then, and not until then, the conductor, Gertrude Cayce, gave him the suggestion. After listening to this reading, I was most impressed, and I thought that this was a man of God. I have never changed my mind through all the years which have followed. After the hospital folded, this contact with Edgar Cayce brought me an invitation to join his Search for God study group program and the healing program that God Helpers work. Ruth Lenore published When the Last Trumpet is Sounded, a compilation of the readings on the life of Jesus in 1978. Elsie Secrist and her husband Wilfred received readings from Edgar Cayce in 1943. During the years prior to Edgar's death in 1945, they became warm personal friends. Elsie took part in the first group study of the Edgar Cayce readings in New York City. She and her husband continued this activity in Los Angeles and later in Houston, Texas. Elsie served as the national director of the Association Study Group program. She traveled to colleges, universities, churches, and A.R.E conferences throughout the country, and even appeared on radio and television shows to introduce more people to the Cayce work. In developing her lecture, conference, and study group programs, Elsie focused on using suggestions from the readings on dreams to encourage people to record, study, and work with the language of their own unconscious. She wrote, "The importance Cayce attached to the dream emphasizes its spiritual content and its moral importance to the conscious mind of the dreamer. In this spiritual sense, dreams have a universality as fundamental as breathing itself. Visions or dreams, in whatever character they may come, are the reflection of physical conditions, the subconscious, or a projection from the spiritual forces, the superconscious, to the subconscious of the individual. According to Edgar Cayce, unless an individual is seeking to improve his spiritual life by asking for help in terms of prayer, his dreams will primarily be a meaningless jumble. If, however, he is unselfishly seeking God's will for him, then the higher consciousness will monitor his dreams and give him a clearer sense of direction in his daily life." Gina Cerminara went to Virginia Beach in 1945, shortly after receiving her Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin. She had read Segru's biography of Edgar Cayce and wanted to investigate the Cayce files concerning reincarnation. She writes that it is not true, as rumor persistently has it, that I went there as a skeptic and became a believer. I went there as a person who believed in reincarnation, largely because of a theosophical background, but who wanted the confirmation that the Cayce material promised to provide. She says that she spent 2 years studying the files, and this research eventually became the 2 books, Many Mansions and The World Within. Gina was also interested in comparative religion. At one point in her life, she tried to go to a different church or temple every week by way of exploring various approaches. Gina published her book, Insights for the Age of Aquarius, a scientific analysis of the problems of religion, in 1973. In the book, she uses general semantics, her specialty, as a new kind of scientific methodology for examining the origins of knowledge. She says it's also a system for analyzing the way communication takes place and the ways in which it breaks down. For Gina, fresh insights can be reached when we look at the mechanics of language within spiritual teachings. Gina writes, "To share our view of reality with each other is more sensible and expedient than to quarrel about it, because in the sharing of it, each of us may be greatly enriched." Eula Allen was introduced to Edgar Cayce in 1941 by a neighbor, Mignon Helms. At that time, the Allens were in Norfolk, Virginia. This was to be the beginning of an important relationship for Eula and her family. It was also the beginning of a phase of Eula's life that would influence many people, leading them into a new understanding of themselves and their relationship to God. Eula's husband Harold was an officer in the Navy. They and their son Laurie received several readings from Edgar Cayce. During the war years, the Navy assigned Harold to many different areas, and Eula moved with him. Everywhere they went, Eula introduced others to Edgar Cayce's work. Through personal contact and through giving talks to groups, she became an enthusiastic missionary of the work and its philosophy. As a hostess or lecturer, Eula served the A.R.E. with warmth and enthusiasm. Her presence always gave strength and encouragement to those about her. Edgar Cayce wrote her in 1942, expressing his hope that she would attend the Congress that year, saying, "Know all here in our Bible study will feel better for having you with us, even for a day." After the war, the Allens returned to Norfolk and entered into the work of the A.R.E. with zest and dedication. They both served as trustees at different times, and Harold took on the management of the A.R.E. Press. Eula attended study groups, the prayer group, and the Tuesday night Bible class that had been taught by Mr. Cayce. She was selected by lot, following the deaths of Edgar and Gertrude, to become a member of the Search for God Study Group No. 1. Eula became very popular as a lecturer, both at headquarters conferences and across the country. Her subjects most often were creation and reincarnation. In her third reading given by Edgar Cayce, Eula Allen asked, "How can I best apply my understanding for the benefit of others?" The answer was, "Put it on paper and publish it." Her studies of the readings on creation led to the writing of 3 books, Before the Beginning, The River of Time, and You Are Forever. Gladys Davis writes, "In her warmth and compassion, Eula gave love, tending people with the same energy she gave her verdant garden. Never coddling, she demanded the best one had to give." Her work with young people who wandered into the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area was most successful. Under her tutelage, many a lost soul turned a life around to become a responsible, contributing, mature individual. Over the years, she kept a series of notebooks into which she wrote her poems and the thoughts that came after meditation. A letter she wrote to Edgar Cayce tells of an enlightenment experience and serves as her personal introduction to her own works of poetry. In the letter, she detailed her struggle with prayer and her efforts to clear from her mind the debris that interfered with prayer. In her effort to make contact, she had experienced hitting a complete negative force that bounced me off and back like a spring, and she did not understand what she had hit. She wrote that when she strove to recognize the positive force of God, she realized she had been, in her words, recognizing the destructive instead of the constructive. "I have a completely new picture of what we are and our relativity to all the material life around us." Also to the hollow crust of material supremacy we have brought to a head. But the faster it explodes, the sooner will spiritual supremacy be recognized. I feel the chaos of our world is caused by the spiritual forces moving in on the material, and material can answer back, in the only way and under the only law it knows. Eula grew in spirituality, walking daily with the Christ, referring to him as the Master. He was more real to her and dearer than any relative or close friend. This special relationship, developed through prayer and meditation, guided her in her personal growth and understanding. Her study of the readings and their philosophy led her in her attempts to live fully what she believed.